Look at that. Look at that pathetic little joke standing right there. Bradley Cole's voice cut through the evening air of Church Hill like a blade dragged slowly across skin. He said it loudly, deliberately, making sure every passerby on the sidewalk turned to look. Elias Thorne. The Elias Thorne. Sleeping in doorways now is he. Tell me, Elias, did the money run out? Or did you finally lose what was left of your mind? The man standing at the mouth of the alley did not move. He wore a coat the color of old rust, the seams split at both shoulders and dark glasses that hid eyes no one on that street was meant to recognize. In his right hand, a white cane trembled slightly against the pavement, not from performance but from the bone-deep cold that had settled into him after 3 weeks of sleeping wherever the night allowed. Bradley laughed, the sound sharp and theatrical, and raised his phone to film. Everybody say hello to the great chairman of Thorne Health Network. Billionaire. Genius. Self-made man. Look at him now. Can't even afford a real coat. This is priceless. This is going straight online. A small crowd gathered the way crowds always do around cruelty, drawn by the promise of spectacle rather than the discomfort of watching a man be torn apart in public. Someone laughed. A teenager whistled. A woman near the coffee shop window pulled her child a little closer, as though poverty itself might be contagious. Elias Thorne did not answer. He could not answer. Not without breaking the fragile disguise that stood between him and the life he had built, the empire his father had bled, for the reputation that thousands of employees and patients depended on. So he stood there and let the words land one after another, each one finding the exact place inside him that still, after everything, knew how to bleed. You know what's funny? Bradley stepped closer, close enough that Elias could smell the expensive cologne, the kind that had once a lifetime ago sat on Elias's own bathroom shelf before all of this began. Your father used to lecture me about dignity, about building something real. And here you are begging for scraps on a street corner like a stray dog. What would he say if he could see his precious son now? I bet he'd be ashamed. I bet he'd wish he'd left the company to literally anyone else. The words hit harder than Bradley could have known. Not because they were true, but because for one unbearable second, Elias wondered if they were. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. His hand tightened around the handle of the cane. Every instinct screamed at him to speak, to straighten his spine, to let the mask fall and watch Bradley Cole's smug expression collapse into horror and apology. It would take 4 words. 4 words, and this would end. But 4 words would also end the only honest test he had left in a world that had stopped being honest with him the moment his father's obituary made the front page. So instead, Elias lowered his head the way a man does when he has learned through repetition and necessity that eye contact only invites more cruelty. He turned to walk away. "Where are you going?" Bradley called after him, delighted, following a few steps with the phone still raised. "Don't you want your 15 minutes? This is going to get 1 million views by morning. Disgraced billionaire living on the streets. Or maybe Elias Thorne finally gets what he deserves." Catchy, right? Laughter rippled through the small crowd again. Somewhere behind him, a woman's voice, not unkind but not brave enough to intervene either, murmured, "That's so sad," in the detached tone people use for tragedies that belong to someone else. Elias kept walking. His legs, thin now beneath the ruined trousers, ached with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones built over 3 weeks of concrete benches of doorways that offered no real shelter from the wind sweeping up from the James River of nights. So cold his teeth had chattered until his jaw ached, and sleep came only in broken, shivering fragments. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. His cheeks had hollowed. His hands, once steady enough to sign billion-dollar mergers without a tremor, now shook faintly from hunger more nights than not. He had told himself at the beginning that this would be simple. 3 weeks. Find one person, just one, who would treat him with kindness, while believing he had nothing to offer in return. He had not accounted for how much it would cost him to be looked at with contempt by people who once shook his hand and called him a visionary. He had not accounted for the particular specific pain of hearing his father's name used as a weapon. He rounded the corner onto a quieter street out of sight of the small, cruel audience, and allowed himself finally to stop. He pressed his back against the cold brick of a shuttered storefront and closed his eyes behind the dark glasses. "Would you be ashamed of me, Dad?" The question surfaced before he could stop it, and with it came the memory sharp unbidden of his father in the old clinic sleeves rolled up kneeling in front of a frightened child with a stethoscope saying the same thing. He always said, "Money can wait, son. People can't." Elias had been young, then poor, then watching his father give away what little they had to people who had even less. He remembered the particular hunger of those years, the kind that made a boy stare too long at other children's lunch trays, that made a mother stretch one chicken across an entire week. He remembered it now with a clarity that frightened him because for 3 weeks, he had not had to remember it. He had lived it again. A gust of wind cut down the street, and Elias flinched, pulling the thin coat tighter around a frame that had once filled out $3,000 suits with ease. Somewhere above him a window went dark, as a family settled in for the evening warm light, the shape of a table, the outline of people who belonged to one another. He watched it for a long moment, the ache in his chest sharpening into something almost unbearable. He was not afraid of the cold. He had learned over 3 weeks that the body adjusts to cold in ways the mind never fully adjusts to humiliation. What frightened him, what had begun quietly to frighten him more each day, was the growing suspicion that he might walk this entire city and find no one, that the version of humanity his father had believed in so completely might simply no longer exist. That kindness, real and unconditional, had become a story people told children before the world corrected them. 2 more weeks, he told himself, pushing off from the wall, forcing his legs to carry him forward into the dark. If I find no one, I stop looking. He did not yet know that 4 blocks away, behind the fogged window of a small diner glowing gold against the coming night, someone was about to prove him wrong. The apartment was not really an apartment at all. A single rented room above a shuttered hardware store on the edge of Church Hill, paid for in cash under a name that belonged to no one, furnished with nothing but a folding cot, a space heater, and a duffel bag containing the only clothes Elias Thorne allowed himself to own for the next several weeks. The window looked out over a narrow alley, where a street lamp flickered every few seconds, throwing pale light across the bare walls in irregular pulses like something struggling to stay alive. Elias sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, still wearing the ruined coat, because the room was barely warmer than the street outside. His hands folded loosely in front of him had a faint tremor, he told himself, came from the cold and not from Bradley Cole's voice, still echoing somewhere behind his ribs. Your father would be ashamed of you. He had heard worse in boardrooms. He had weathered hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, 100 reporters shouting questions after his father's funeral. None of it had cut the way those words had cut, delivered by a man who had once called himself a friend in a voice loud enough for strangers to enjoy. A key turned in the lock, the only other person alive who had one, and Jerry Voss stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket, a grocery bag in one hand, and an expression that had already decided this conversation would not be gentle. I heard what happened on Marshall Street. Jerry set the bag down harder than necessary. Bradley Cole, filming you. It's already got 40,000 views, Elias. 40,000 people watching a grown man mock a homeless veteran, except the homeless man happens to be the chairman of the largest hospital network in the country, and none of them know it yet. I know. Elias's voice came out quieter than he intended. I was there. You were there. Jerry's jaw tightened. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and crouched in front of the cot, forcing Elias to meet his eyes. Do you understand what I watched on that video? A man I've known since we were 17 years old, standing there and taking it, not defending himself, not saying a single word. I've seen you walk into rooms full of senators and not blink. I've seen you take on hedge funds that wanted to gut this company for parts. And you stood on a sidewalk and let Bradley Cole call your father a fool, and you said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't end this. Maybe it should end. Jerry's voice cracked slightly, the frustration underneath finally breaking through the discipline he usually wore like armor. 3 weeks, Elias. You've lost, 15 pounds, your hands shake now. I watched you flinch at a car backfiring last Tuesday like it was. He stopped himself, the sentence dying before it could finish, but the unspoken end of it hung in the room anyway, heavy and familiar to both of them. Elias looked away first. Like it was the crash, he finished quietly because someone had to say it, and it was easier coming from his own mouth than from Jerry's. Say it, Jerry. You can say it. I wasn't going to. I know you weren't. You never do. Elias exhaled long and slow, and for a moment the mask of calm control that he wore, even here, even alone with the one person who had earned the right to see him without it, slipped just slightly. I still hear it sometimes. The sound, not the crash itself. I don't remember much of that, thank God. I mean after. Lying in that hospital bed, 19 years old, and my father sitting there telling me it wasn't my fault over and over, like if he said it enough times I might actually believe him. Jerry sat back on his heels, quiet, now letting him talk. In 15 years of friendship, these moments were rare enough that he had learned never to interrupt them. He never once raised his voice at me. Elias continued staring at some fixed point on the floor. Not about the car, not about the money we didn't have to fix it or the medical bills that piled up faster than the free clinic ever brought in. He just kept working. Double shifts. Selling his own watch to cover the copay on my second surgery. And I used to lie awake in that house, the one with the leak in the roof that we caught in a bucket every time it rained, and I used to think, I will make this right. Someday I will make sure he never has to sell one more thing for me again. You did make it right, Jerry said. You built something extraordinary. He knew that before he died. Did he? Elias's eyes lifted, and there was something raw in them now. Something that had nothing to do with 3 weeks of sleeping outside. Because the last 5 years of his life, every conversation we had was about margins and mergers and market share. I gave him an empire, Jerry, and somewhere along the way I think I stopped giving him a son. He shook his head slowly. That's why I'm out here. Not to prove people are cruel, I already know that. I'm out here because I need to remember what he actually taught me, before I turn into every corporate obituary the business papers will eventually write about me. Compassion first, money second. He said that to me 1,000 times, and somewhere in the last 10 years I think I got it backwards. Jerry was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the street lamp flickered again, and somewhere below the wind pushed an empty can rattling down the alley. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. I still don't think starving yourself half to death on a street corner is what your father meant by compassion first. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Elias's mouth, the first in 3 weeks. No, probably not. You've got 2 more weeks before the gala, and the board is already asking questions I can't keep answering forever. Jerry reached into the grocery bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, setting it gently on the cot beside him. Not charity, just the quiet insistence of a friend who refused to watch him waste away entirely. Disguise or no disguise. Eat something. Please. For me, if not for yourself. Elias looked at the sandwich for a long moment before picking it up, his hands still faintly unsteady. There's someone, he said finally, almost reluctantly, as though testing the words in his own mouth for the first time. A woman. At a little diner 4 blocks from here. She's fed me twice now. Doesn't ask questions. Doesn't flinch when I can't pay. There was something in the way she looked at me, Jerry, not pity, not curiosity, just decency. Like it cost her nothing to be kind, and like it never occurred to her that it should. Jerry studied his friend's face for a moment, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or the fragile beginning of it appearing for the first time in longer than he could remember. What's her name? I don't know yet. Elias unwrapped the sandwich slowly, his voice quieter now, almost private. But I intend to find out. Jerry didn't answer right away. He simply nodded once, stood, and moved to the small window looking out at the rain-slicked street below, at the flickering lamp, at the city that had no idea what or who was quietly walking through it. Something in his chest, some old and practiced wariness, told him this would not be simple. That whoever this woman was, she was about to become the center of something far larger than either of them yet understood. But for tonight, watching Elias Thorne eat a sandwich in a cold borrowed room, and speak of another person's kindness with something close to wonder in his voice, Jerry allowed himself just this once to hope that his oldest friend might actually find his way back to himself. Outside, the rain kept falling steady and quiet, washing the last of Bradley Cole's laughter off the pavement 4 blocks away, though neither of them yet knew how much further from finish that particular cruelty truly was. Miller's Diner sat on the corner of a quiet Church Hill street, its neon sign missing the letter R, so that at night it simply read, Mill S, glowing faintly pink against the brick. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and bacon grease, and something sweeter underneath apple pie, maybe cooling on a back counter. A bell above the door announced every entrance with a small, cheerful chime, utterly indifferent to who walked through it. Elias Thorne stepped inside, that evening the way he always did now, slowly, cane-extended shoulders drawn slightly inward as though trying to take up less space in a world that had already decided he deserved none. The dinner crowd had thinned. A trucker nursed the last of his coffee near the window. An elderly couple split a slice of pie in comfortable silence. And behind the counter, wiping down the same 6 inches of countertop for the 3rd time simply to have something to do with her hands, stood Abigail Shaw. She looked up when the bell rang, and something in her face changed, the instant she recognized him. Not pity, not the careful performative sympathy. Elias had grown so exhausted by these past weeks, but a small, genuine brightening, the kind of expression reserved for someone she was glad specifically to see. "Hey, you're back." She was already moving before he'd found a stool, sliding a glass of water across the counter, then reaching for a bowl. "You're just in time. I was about to toss the last of the chicken soup, and it seems criminal to waste good soup. You don't have to keep doing this." The words came out rougher than he intended, worn down by 3 weeks of saying some version of the same sentence to a woman who never once listened to it. "I know I don't have to." Abby set the bowl down in front of him along with a napkin and a spoon, arranging them with a small, unnecessary precision, as if the gesture itself mattered. "That's sort of the point, isn't it?" He looked up at her, then really looked the way he had allowed himself to only twice before. She couldn't have been older than 26, her brown hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, an apron stained faintly with coffee at the hip, exhaustion sitting quietly beneath her eyes in a way that spoke of double shifts and thin sleep. And yet nothing about her demeanor suggested a woman keeping some invisible ledger tallying up kindness owed and kindness given. She simply moved through the world as though feeding a hungry stranger required no more justification than breathing. "Why do you do it?" he asked the question, escaping before he could measure it. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be dangerous." Something flickered across her face, not fear, but a memory, brief and private. "My father used to say something to me when I was young enough that I still followed him around like a shadow." She leaned against the counter, her voice softening into something almost reverent. He said, "Abby, when you see someone who's fallen, you give them your hand first. You ask questions later if you ask them at all." He believed that. Really believed it all the way down. Not the kind of thing people say and then forget the second it's inconvenient. He sounds like a rare man. He was a doctor. Abby's eyes drifted unfocused toward some point beyond the diner's fogged window. Worked at a free clinic on the east side for almost 30 years. Half his patients couldn't pay him a dime, and he treated them exactly the same as the ones who could. "My mother used to fight with him about it. We never had much growing up because he kept giving away what little we did have. But I never once heard him regret it. Not one time." Elias went very still. "What was his name?" The question came out low, careful, as though he already suspected the answer might shift the ground beneath him. "Walter." A faint, sad smile touched her mouth. "Dr. Walter Shaw. He passed 5 years ago now." Heart gave out ironic for a man who spent his whole life fixing other people's. The spoon in Elias's hand went motionless above the bowl. Somewhere behind his ribs, something turned over slowly, like a key finding a lock it had spent years searching for without knowing it. Walter Shaw. The name surfaced from some buried compartment of memory, a name he had read only once before weeks ago, in his father's old ledger, in his father's own handwriting beside a date, circled twice in faded blue ink. He said nothing. He could say nothing, not yet, not without unraveling 3 weeks of carefully guarded silence in the space of a single sentence. But his hand, when he finally lifted the spoon again, was not entirely steady. "You're staring," Abby said, not unkindly, tilting her head. "Did I say something strange?" "No." He forced his voice back into its careful, unremarkable register. "You said something kind. I'm not used to it anymore. It takes me by surprise." She studied him a moment longer, long enough that he wondered with a small jolt of alarm whether she could somehow see straight through the ruined coat and the dark glasses to the man underneath. But whatever she saw, she let it pass without comment, sliding a slice of bread across the counter instead. "Well, get used to it while you're in here. Nobody eats alone on my watch, not if I can help it." They talked a while longer, or rather she talked, filling the small silences with easy, unguarded conversation, the kind that asked nothing in return. She told him about the diner, about Mrs. Elaine Whitfield, who owned it, and had given Abby her first job at 16 out of pure, stubborn kindness. She told him without quite meaning to about her mother's mounting medical bills, about a younger sister who resented her for reasons Abby herself didn't fully understand. About a small ache of loneliness she never let herself dwell on for long. She did not ask his name. She did not ask where he slept, or how he'd come to be sitting hollow-cheeked and threadbare on a stool in her diner 3 nights running. She simply let him exist there, warm and fed, for as long as he needed to stay. When he finally rose to leave, murmuring a thank you that felt entirely insufficient for what she'd given him, she pressed a small paper bag into his hand. 2 biscuits wrapped carefully for later, she said, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He did not go back to the rented room above the hardware store. Instead, he walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction into the small 24-hour library branch that stayed lit long after the rest of the street had gone dark, and asked the night clerk in a voice he kept carefully unremarkable whether he might use one of the computers for a few minutes. His hands trembled not from cold this time as he typed the name into the search bar. Dr. Walter Shaw, Richmond, Virginia, Free Clinic. The article that appeared was 15 years old. A small community newspaper piece with a grainy photograph. A younger Walter Shaw kneeling beside a hospital bed, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of a frightened boy while a thin, exhausted-looking woman stood nearby, her expression somewhere between terror and gratitude. The caption beneath it read, "Local doctor treats uninsured patients free of charge this week, a mother and son from the east side following a serious car accident." Elias did not need to read further. He recognized the woman in the photograph instantly, though she had aged 15 years since it was taken, though grief and time had reshaped nearly everything about her face except the particular set of her mouth. His mother. And the boy beside her, small and pale against the hospital sheets, one arm in a cast, himself at 19, though he looked younger in the photograph than he remembered feeling that year. He sat there a long while, the library humming quietly around him, the old grief and the new revelation colliding somewhere deep in his chest, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Walter Shaw, Abby's father, had treated his mother for free in the terrible weeks after the accident that had shattered his family at a time when the Thorns had nothing left to give anyone, least of all a stranger's gratitude. He pulled out his phone and called Jerry, his voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been in years. "I need you to confirm something for me," he said before Jerry had even finished saying hello. "The woman from the diner. Her last name is Shaw. I need to know if her father was Dr. Walter Shaw." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy. "Elias, what is this about?" "Just find out," Elias said quietly, staring at the photograph still glowing on the screen in front of him, his mother's frightened, grateful face, a stranger's gentle hand on his own younger shoulder. "Please. I have to know if this is a coincidence, or if it's something else entirely." Jerry Voss called back at 11:47 that night. Elias was still sitting on the edge of the cot in the rented room, the space heater ticking faintly in the corner, the paper bag with Abby's biscuits untouched on the small table beside him. He had been staring at the same water stain on the ceiling for the better part of an hour, turning the photograph from the library computer over and over in his mind when his phone finally buzzed against the mattress. "It's true." Jerry's voice came through flat, careful, the tone of a man delivering news he suspected would not be received calmly. Walter Shaw, licensed physician, Commonwealth of Virginia, ran a free clinic on the east side for 28 years before he died. One daughter named Abigail, 26 years old, currently employed at Miller's Diner on 23rd Street. There's a younger daughter too, Kayla, 22. Mother's name is Diane. A pause. I cross-referenced the clinic's old patient logs against the county hospital transfer records from 15 years ago, like you asked. Elias, your mother's name is on there. October, the same month as the accident. Elias closed his eyes. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed faintly, and then faded, swallowed by the ordinary noise of the city. Say the rest of it. There isn't much more to say. He treated her for 6 weeks. No charge. The clinic logs list your mother's condition as severe anxiety and exhaustion, following a traumatic incident involving her son. That's it. That's the whole record. Jerry's voice softened slightly, though the caution in it remained. It's real, Elias. It's not a coincidence. Walter Shaw took care of your mother during the worst month of your family's life, and neither of you ever knew the other one existed until 3 weeks ago when his daughter fed a stranger a bowl of soup. Elias said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched long enough that Jerry finally spoke again, gentler this time. "Are you still there?" "I'm here." Elias's voice came out rougher than he intended. He pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes beneath the dark glasses he still hadn't taken off, though there was no one left in the room to hide from but himself. "I keep thinking about my mother sitting in some cramped waiting room, terrified, with no money, and no idea whether she'd have to choose between rent and my medical bills that month, and a stranger just helped her. Didn't ask what she could pay, didn't ask anything at all." He exhaled slowly. "And now his daughter does exactly the same thing for exactly the same reasons to me 15 years later, and she doesn't even know my name. Which is exactly why I need you to be careful right now." The shift in Jerry's tone was immediate, the friend receding, the head of security stepping forward, the man whose entire job for 15 years had been to see the danger in things before Elias could. "You're not thinking about this like a man doing charity research anymore. You're thinking about it like a man who's already decided something about her before he's even had a real conversation with her. That's not fair, isn't it? Jerry's voice sharpened, not with anger exactly, but with the particular frustration of a man watching someone he loved walk toward a cliff edge with his eyes half closed. 3 weeks ago, you wanted to find one honest person in this city who'd treat you like a human being with nothing to gain. That was the whole plan. Simple. Clean. Now you're telling me the first person who passed that test also happens to be the daughter of the one doctor in 15 years who showed your family mercy when nobody else would. Elias, do you hear how that sounds? Like fate wrote it. Like it was always going to be her. Maybe it was. Or maybe Jerry said quieter now, more careful you want it to be because you've spent 3 weeks freezing on a sidewalk waiting for the universe to hand you proof that your father was right about people, and now here's a woman who fits the story a little too perfectly. And you're not exactly in a state of mind to be objective about that. Elias stood restless and crossed to the small window, looking down at the alley below, empty, except for the flickering lamp and a stray cat picking its way along the base of the brick wall. He hated how much sense Jerry's words made. He hated it, precisely because some quiet, exhausted part of him, the part that had gone 3 weeks without sleeping through a single full night, the part that still flinched at the sound of car horns, did not want to hear reason right. Now, it wanted badly for something in this long, humiliating experiment to finally mean something larger than coincidence. I'm not going to tell her, he said finally. Tell her what? That you're not actually a homeless man, or that her dead father saved your mother's life, either. Both. Elias turned from the window. If I tell her now, I'll never know the truth of it. I'll never know if she's kind to me because of who I am or because of some debt she doesn't even know exists between our families. I need to know if it's her. Not her father's ghost. Not mine. Here. Jerry was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge, settling into something heavier, more solemn. I've known you since we were 17 years old, Elias. I watched you become someone people either wanted something from or wanted to destroy, and almost nobody in between. I want this to be real for you. I do. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it. Not just let it pass through you the way you let everything pass through you when you've already made up your mind. Say it. You are not objective anymore. Jerry's words landed slow and deliberate, each one placed with care. You stopped being objective the second you saw her father's name in that old ledger of your dad's. This isn't a controlled experiment now. This is a 19-year-old boy in a hospital bed finally getting to say thank you to the family who helped his mother when nobody else would, except he's dressing it up as something else, because it's easier to disguise gratitude as a social test than to admit how much he still needs to believe good people exist. Jerry paused. I'm not saying she isn't good, Elias. From what little I've seen, she might be exactly what she looks like. But I am saying you can't trust your own judgment on this one. Not fully. Not yet. So let me do what I do. Let me watch her a little longer quietly, before either of us decides what any of this means. Elias's jaw tightened, the old familiar instinct to bristle at oversight, rising up in him, the instinct of a man who had run boardrooms and outlasted hostile takeovers and rarely if ever needed anyone's protection. But beneath that instinct, quieter and more honest, was the memory of Bradley Cole's laughter on Marshall Street of 40,000 strangers watching a stranger mock him and calling it entertainment. The world, he reminded himself, had not exactly proven itself trustworthy these past 3 weeks. Perhaps a little more caution, even now, was not the insult his pride wanted to make of it. Fine, he said finally quietly. Watch her. But Jerry, do it carefully. If you're wrong about her, if she turns out to be exactly what she appears to be, I don't want to have treated her like a suspect for weeks before I ever gave her the chance to just be who she is. Understood. A beat passed. For what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong to worry. I really do. After they hung up, Elias sat back down on the edge of the cot, the photograph from the library still glowing faintly in his memory. His mother's frightened face, the gentle hand of a stranger resting on his own younger shoulder. He thought of Abby sliding a bowl of soup across the counter without a second's hesitation, of the small, unthinking kindness in the way she'd wrapped 2 biscuits for later, as though it had never once occurred to her that kindness needed a reason. He did not yet know whether Jerry's caution would prove necessary, or whether it was simply the old learned wariness of 2 men who had spent too many years watching wealth attract people for all the wrong reasons. But he knew with a certainty that surprised him in its steadiness that he was no longer walking these streets merely to prove his father right about the existence of good people. He was walking them now to find his way back to the family that had once quietly and without any expectation of thanks helped save his own. You are going to sit at that table on Friday night, put on the blue dress I bought you, and smile at Grant Whitmore like your entire future depends on it, because it does. Diane Shaw's voice cracked through the small kitchen like a whip, sharp enough that Abby set down the dish towel she'd been folding and turned to face her mother fully. Do you understand me, Abigail? This is not a request. The Shaw house sat on a narrow street, lined with modest bungalows, the paint on the porch railing peeling in long curls, the roof patched in two places where money had run out before the repairs could finish. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and the lavender hand lotion Diane kept by the sink, a small luxury she allowed herself in a life that had offered her very few. Mom, I've told you already. I'm not interested in Grant Whitmore. Abby kept her voice even though something tight had begun to coil in her chest. I don't care how much money his family has. You don't care, Diane laughed, short and disbelieving the sound, carrying no real humor in it at all. Do you know what I would have given at your age for a man like Grant Whitmore to look twice at me? A man with a name that opens doors, Abby. A man who could make sure you never had to work a double shift again, never had to choose between the electric bill and new shoes for your feet. And you're telling me you don't care. I care about things that actually matter. Abby's hands twisted the dish towel a little tighter. I care about someone who's kind, someone with a good heart, not someone whose father's name is on half the real estate signs in Richmond. Something shifted in Diane's expression, not softening but narrowing the particular sharpness of a mother who has decided her daughter is about to make the same mistake she once made herself. Kind. She repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Your father was kind, Abby. The kindest man I ever knew. And when he died, kindness didn't pay a single one of his debts. Kindness didn't keep the lights on. I loved him, God. I loved him more than I've ever loved anything, and I buried him owing more money than either of us made in 5 years combined because he gave away everything he had to people who could never pay him back. I will not watch you walk down that same road and call it love. This isn't the same thing. Isn't it? Diane's voice dropped quieter now, and somehow that was worse than the shouting. There's a man, isn't there? Somebody you've mentioned twice now and won't tell me anything about. Somebody with nothing. Abby said nothing, which was answer enough. Oh, Abigail. Diane pressed a hand to her forehead, the gesture equal parts exhaustion and despair. Please tell me it isn't that man from the diner, the one Kayla mentioned, the one who… She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them anyway, heavy with everything. Diane refused to say plainly, the one who sleeps outside, the one who has nothing, the one who will make you exactly as poor and exhausted as I have been for the last 5 years. His name is Eli. Abby said, quietly lifting her chin. And he has a good heart, Mom. That's more than I can say for most people with money. A good heart doesn't pay rent. Diane's control finally broke, the words coming out raw and desperate. I watched your father's good heart bury us in debt. I am not going to watch it bury you too. Grant comes Friday. You will be there. You will smile. And you will at least try for me after everything I have sacrificed to keep this family standing. Abby opened her mouth to argue further, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Kayla, 22, dark-haired and sharp-featured in a way that had always drawn easy attention, descending in a t-shirt and pajama shorts, phone in hand, expression already curdled with the particular resentment she seemed to reserve exclusively for her older sister. Let me guess. Kayla leaned against the doorframe, scrolling idly. Abby's picking the homeless guy over Grant Whitmore again. Real shocker. Kayla, this isn't. No, it's fine. Kayla's smile was thin, humorless. It's actually kind of impressive, honestly. Most people spend their whole lives trying to get out of poor. You're out here actively recruiting it. She looked up and something colder flickered behind her eyes. You know what's funny? You've always gotten everything, Abby. Top of your class. Every job you ever applied for. Every guy who ever walked into that diner ends up half in love with you within a week. And now you've got 2 men fighting over you. An actual millionaire's son, and some guy who probably doesn't even remember his own last name. And you're still finding a way to make yourself the tragic, misunderstood one. It must be exhausting being that special. That's not fair, Abby said quietly, the hurt in her voice more visible than she wanted it to be. I never asked for any of that. Nobody ever does. Kayla pushed off from the doorframe and crossed the kitchen, snatching an apple from the counter with a sharpness that felt less like hunger and more like punctuation. Must be nice, though, being the good one. The pretty one. The one Dad always said reminded him of himself. Her voice cracked almost imperceptibly on the last few words, and for one unguarded second something raw and old passed across her face. Not malice, but a wound that had clearly never fully closed. Then it was gone, sealed back behind the familiar sharpness. "Enjoy your beggar, Abby. I hope he's worth losing everything for." She left the kitchen before Abby could respond, disappearing back up the stairs, and a moment later the muffled bass of music through a closed bedroom door signaled that the conversation, as far as Kayla was concerned, was finished. Diane sighed, some of the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by a tiredness that seemed to settle into every line of her face. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds. She means it exactly the way it sounds. Abby folded the dish towel one final time, laying it carefully over the oven handle, needing something small and precise to do with her hands. "She's meant it since we were kids. I don't know why." "Because you never had to try," Diane said, simply, not unkindly, just tired and honest in the particular way. Exhaustion sometimes forces honesty out of people, and she's had to try at everything. That's a hard thing to live next to Abby, even when you love the person you're living next to. Abby didn't answer. She climbed the stairs a few minutes later, past Kayla's closed door and its muffled music, into the small bedroom she'd occupied since childhood, its walls still faintly marked with the outline of posters long since taken down. She sat on the edge of her bed and reached for her phone on the nightstand, intending to check whether Eli had texted the number she'd given him 3 days earlier. A small, hopeful habit that had crept into her evenings without her quite noticing. The phone wasn't there. She checked the nightstand again, then the dresser, then the pockets of the jacket she'd worn that morning, a small flutter of unease building in her chest. It had been there that afternoon. She was certain of it. Down the hall behind Kayla's closed door, the music continued indifferent and steady, while 4 blocks away, in a rented room above a shuttered hardware store, a man in a threadbare coat sat waiting for a text message that would never arrive, the first quiet, unnoticed cruelty of many still to come. The video appeared online sometime after midnight, uploaded from an account with barely 300 followers, and by the time the sun came up over Church Hill it had been shared more than 12,000 times. The caption read simply, "When your sister brings home a literal homeless man and calls it love lol." Beneath it, grainy footage taken through the front window of the Shaw house days earlier, phone angled low and hidden, showed Elias standing awkwardly on the front porch, cane in hand, while a security guard from the gated community 2 streets over shooed him off the property with a raised hand and a sharp word that hadn't been audible until someone had slowed the clip down and added captions in bright yellow text. "Not Felicia's type. Get off the property." Kayla had found the footage on her own phone 3 days earlier, filmed on impulse during a moment of pure unexamined spite, and had told herself for 2 nights that she wouldn't actually post it. She told herself that again on the 3rd night, right up until the moment her thumb pressed share anyway, and something in her chest had gone hollow and cold. Immediately afterward, the particular emptiness that follows an act a person already regrets before it is finished loading. By morning, half of Church Hill had seen it. Elias did not see the video himself. He had no phone, no accounts, nothing to alert him to the small cruelty circulating 4 blocks from where he slept. It was Jerry who found it first, scrolling through a local community forum at 6 in the morning, with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in his other hand. And it was Jerry's face, pale and grim, that Elias read the news from an hour later, standing in the doorway of the rented room with his coat still damp from the walkover. "You need to see this." Elias watched the clip twice in silence, his jaw tightening with each replay, though not for the reason Jerry expected. "It's not the humiliation that bothers me," Elias said, finally handing the phone back. "God knows I've had worse this month. It's that Abby's going to see this before I've had the chance to explain any of it to her myself. And I still don't have anything true to tell her that doesn't unravel everything." "That's not actually what I called you over for." Jerry's voice had shifted into something more careful, more deliberate, the tone he used only when he'd found something that mattered. He set his coffee down on the small table and pulled a folder from his bag, thin and unmarked, the kind of file that looked unremarkable precisely because someone had once wanted it to. "I was digging into Whitmore Realty's holdings last night. Standard due diligence. The kind I always run before letting anyone near you socially. Grant Whitmore's name kept coming up in connection to your family's old clinic property, and I wanted to know why before I mentioned it." Elias sat down slowly on the edge of the cot. "Go on." "Whitmore Realty made 3 separate offers on the clinic land between 18 and 15 years ago. All 3 rejected. Your father wouldn't sell no matter what they offered. The paperwork gets strange after the 3rd offer." Jerry opened the folder, sliding a photocopied document across the small table. "There's a payment recorded in an old subsidiary account. Whitmore Development Partners dissolved 11 years ago, buried under 3 layers of shell companies. One-time disbursement, cash, no invoice attached. dated 3 days before the accident. The word landed in the small room like a stone dropped into still water. Elias didn't move. Say that again. 3 days before the accident that put you in the hospital and put your father in that clinic bed 6 months later with a heart that never fully recovered. Jerry's voice stayed level deliberately, so the careful flatness of a man delivering news he knew would detonate something the moment it finished being said. I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet. I want to be clear about that. It could be nothing. A land payment for something completely unrelated, coincidental timing, nothing more. But I've spent 15 years training myself to notice when something doesn't add up, and this doesn't add up, Elias. A cash disbursement with no invoice, buried 3 shell companies deep 3 days before your family's life fell apart from the one company that had spent 2 years trying and failing to force your father off that land. He closed the folder gently. I wanted you to know before I dug further. Because if this goes where I think it might go, it's not going to be a small thing to carry. Elias sat very still, staring at the closed folder as though it might, given enough time, simply dissolve back into nothing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory surfaced that he had not let himself examine closely in 15 years. His father, weeks after the accident, sitting at the kitchen table with the porch light off so the neighbors wouldn't see. Him crying, saying quietly, to no one in particular, they finally got what they wanted anyway. I just never thought it would cost this much. At the time, 19 years old and half delirious with pain medication and grief, Elias had assumed his father meant the money, the mounting bills, the years of savings drained by hospital visits. He had never once considered that his father might have meant something else entirely. He knew, Elias said quietly, more to himself than to Jerry. My father knew something, or suspected it, and he never told me. Maybe he didn't want to put that weight on a 19-year-old kid who was already fighting to walk again. Jerry's voice softened, some of the investigator's careful distance falling away, replaced by the old familiar concern of a friend who had watched this particular grief reshape his best friend's entire adult life. Or maybe he genuinely didn't know for certain. Suspicion isn't proof. I don't have proof yet, Elias. I have a strange payment and a timeline that lines up in a way I don't like. That's all. I need more time before either of us decides what it means. How much more time? A week. Maybe 2. Jerry hesitated, watching his friend's face carefully. I need you to hear me on something, though, and I need you to actually hear it, not just nod and file it away, the way you do when you've already decided something. Whatever this turns out to be, if it turns out to be anything at all, it changes the shape of everything you've been doing these past 3 weeks. This stops being a quiet, private test of human kindness the moment it becomes a question of what happened to your family 15 years ago. Grant Whitmore's name is already tangled up in Abby's life, whether either of you likes it or not. If his family did what I think they might have done, this is no longer just about finding one good person in Richmond. This is about your family, your father, what actually happened that night versus the story you've told yourself about it for 15 years. Elias said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point past Jerry's shoulder, past the small water-stained window, past the flickering street lamp outside, somewhere further back into a night he had spent a decade and a half trying not to fully remember. The screech of metal. His father's voice, later calm and steady in a hospital corridor, insisting it wasn't anyone's fault. The particular specific exhaustion in his father's face over the years that followed, an exhaustion Elias had always attributed simply to grief and hard work and the ordinary weight of rebuilding a life, never once to the possibility that his father had been carrying a suspicion alone for years and had chosen silence rather than burden his recovering son with it. Find out, Elias said finally, his voice quiet but resolved, stripped of its usual careful control. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I need to know the truth about that night, Jerry. I've spent 15 years believing it was simply bad luck. A wet road, a driver who wasn't paying attention, nothing more sinister than that. If it was something else, his voice caught just slightly before he steadied it again. If someone did this to my family on purpose, I need to know. My father deserves that much even now. Especially now. Jerry nodded once, gathering the folder back into his bag. I'll have more by the end of the week. He left a few minutes later, the door clicking shut behind him, and Elias sat alone in the small room for a long time afterward, the flickering street lamp outside casting its irregular pulse of light across the water-stained ceiling, while somewhere in the depths of his memory a night he had spent 15 years trying to bury began quietly and irrevocably to surface. Jerry Voss came back in 6 days, not 2 weeks. and the difference told Elias everything he needed to know about how quickly this had stopped being a routine investigation. It was raining again when he arrived, a thin, persistent Richmond rain that blurred the street lamp outside into a smear of orange against the wet glass. Jerry didn't sit down. He stood just inside the door of the small rented room, water dripping from the hem of his jacket onto the bare floor, a thick manila folder held against his chest like something he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hand over. "You should sit," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Elias." Jerry's voice had none of its usual composure. "Sit down." Something in his friend's tone made Elias obey, without argument, lowering himself onto the edge of the cot, hands loosely folded, bracing for something he did not yet have the shape of. Jerry opened the folder and laid the contents out one piece at a time, methodical even now. Even shaken, because methodical was the only way he knew how to survive delivering news like this. An insurance report 15 years old, water damaged at one corner. A photocopied page from a private investigator's file. The kind of document that was never meant to surface in any courtroom, let alone in a rented room above a hardware store. A handwritten note, the ink faded to pale gray, tucked into the margin of a claims report in handwriting Jerry had already had authenticated by 3 separate experts before he'd allowed himself to believe it. "The accident wasn't an accident," Jerry said quietly. 15 years ago, on the night your family's car went off Route 9, there was a second vehicle, a commercial box truck. It struck your car, deliberately sideswiped it hard enough to send it into the guardrail, then left the scene before anyone arrived. No witnesses came forward at the time. The official report listed it as a single-vehicle accident caused by wet road conditions, because that's what the responding officer wrote down. Because that's what the paint transfer analysis buried, never followed up on, filed and forgotten, in a records room for over a decade, was never properly investigated. Elias sat perfectly still. "Whose truck?" Jerry slid the last document across the small table, the one with the handwritten margin note. "Registered to a logistics contractor who did and still does exclusive work for Whitmore Realty. The note here, I had 3 people confirm the handwriting, says, quote, handled per Mr. Whitmore's instruction. Thorne family should feel sufficient pressure now to reconsider the clinic property." His voice cracked just slightly on the final words. "It's dated the morning after the accident, Elias. They ran your family off the road on purpose, to scare your father into selling the clinic land." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rain against the window and the faint arrhythmic tick of the space heater in the corner. Elias did not move. He sat with his hands folded, his face gone very still, very pale. The particular stillness of a man whose entire understanding of his own history had just been rewritten in the space of a single sentence. 19 years old, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 19 years old, lying in a hospital bed for 6 weeks, learning how to see again out of an eye that never fully recovered. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a wet road or a tired driver, or any of the 1,000 small, meaningless explanations I've told myself for 15 years just so I could stop asking why." His hands, folded in his lap, had begun to tremble, not from cold this time, but from something far deeper, something that had been buried so long it had forgotten how to surface as anything other than a slow, physical shaking. "Someone did this to my family. On purpose. To force my father to sell a piece of land where he treated people for free, because he couldn't stand the thought of turning away a sick child whose parents couldn't pay." "Elias." "My eyes, Jerry." His voice rose now, cracking with something raw and long suppressed. "The doctors always said the retinal condition was genetic, a dormant thing in my family's bloodline that could have surfaced at any point in my life, accident or no accident. But the trauma from that night, the blow to my skull when the car hit the guardrail, that's what triggered it early. That's what accelerated everything. 15 years of slowly losing my sight. And it traces back to a truck that hit us on purpose, dispatched by a man whose son is currently trying to marry the one person in this entire city who's shown me an ounce of real kindness." He stood abruptly, crossing to the small window, his reflection ghostly and fractured in the rain-streaked glass. His breathing had gone ragged, shallow, the careful control that had carried him through boardrooms and hostile takeovers and 3 weeks of public humiliation finally completely breaking apart. "My father knew," he said, quieter now, the anger giving way to something heavier. Or he suspected. "That night at the kitchen table, I remember it now clear as anything, he said. They finally got what they wanted anyway. I thought he meant the money. God, Jerry, I thought he was just grieving the cost of my hospital bills. He was carrying this alone. For years. He never told me, never told the police, never went after them. He just kept working, kept building the clinic back up. kept absorbing the damage quietly rather than putting his injured son through the trauma of knowing the truth. His voice broke fully now, and he pressed a hand against the cold window pane, steadying himself. He protected me from this. Right up until the day he died, he protected me from this, and I never even knew there was anything to protect me from. Jerry crossed the room slowly and stood beside him, not touching him, simply present the way he had learned to be present during the worst moments of the last 15 years. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that's not enough, but I am. Grant's father did this." Elias's voice had gone low and flat, now stripped of the raw emotion of a moment ago, replaced by something colder, more focused. The particular calm that settles over a man once grief has burned through its first violent wave and left something harder in its place. Not Grant himself, not 15 years ago he'd have been a teenager, but his father authorized it, ordered it, and built an empire on land deals and intimidation tactics that nearly killed my entire family. And I've spent 3 weeks watching his son try to marry into the one family that showed my mother mercy when we had nothing left. What do you want to do?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the glass, his reflection fractured and doubled in the orange streetlight beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something resolute, though the grief underneath it had not lessened, only reorganized itself into something he could carry forward instead of simply beneath. "I want proof. Real proof, the kind that holds up not just what we have here." He turned to face Jerry fully. "And then I want justice, not revenge, Jerry. I need you to understand the difference, because I've watched what revenge does to people and I refuse to become that. But justice. Full accountability. For my father, who carried this alone until it broke his heart in the most literal sense there is. For my mother, who I still don't understand why she isn't in my life anymore. And God. Jerry, I need to ask you to look into that too, because suddenly I'm not sure the story I was told about her is the whole truth either." Jerry's expression shifted, something careful and hesitant passing behind his eyes, though he said nothing, yet only nodded, slowly filing the request away alongside everything else already sensing, though he could not have said exactly why, that the ground beneath both of them was about to shift, again further and more painfully than either of them was prepared for. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Church Hill, steady and indifferent, while 4 blocks away behind the fogged window of a small diner, Abby Shaw closed out the register for the night, entirely unaware that the man she knew only as Eli had just learned the truth of a night that had shaped both of their families long before either of them had ever met. 3 days after Jerry left him alone with the truth about the crash, Elias returned to Miller's Diner in the gray hour just after the dinner rush, when the tables had mostly emptied and the overhead lights buzzed faintly against settling dark outside. He had not slept properly since Jerry's visit. The knowledge sat inside him now like something physical, a stone lodged just beneath his ribs, shifting every time he let his guard down enough to feel it fully. But he had promised himself, walking the 4 blocks from the rented room, that he would not let it show. Not here. Not with her. Abby was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door announced him, and her face did the thing it always did now when she saw him, that small, unguarded brightening entirely without calculation, as though his presence itself was simply good news and nothing more complicated than that. "Hey, stranger." I was starting to worry. She reached automatically for a mug, filling it with coffee before he'd even settled onto the stool. "You didn't come by yesterday. I had some things to sort through." It was, he thought grimly, the truest sentence he'd spoken to her, yet even wrapped as it was in vagueness. "I'm sorry. I should have found a way to let you know. You don't owe me an explanation." She slid the coffee toward him, then reached beneath the counter and produced a paper bag already prepared, already waiting for him the way it had been. The last several visits, a habit formed so naturally between them that neither of them had ever discussed it aloud. "Roast beef today. Mrs. Whitfield made too much, and I told her it'd go to waste otherwise, which between you and me was a lie, but she didn't call me on it." He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, grateful for the warmth of it, grateful more than that, for the simple fact that in this narrow slice of the evening, in this small diner smelling of coffee and grease, none of what Jerry had uncovered existed yet. For a few minutes he could simply be a man being fed by a woman who asked nothing of him in return. "Can I ask you something?" Abby said, leaning against the counter across from him, her voice quieter now, more careful. "And you don't have to answer if it's too much. Go ahead. What happened to you? Before all this, I mean. You don't talk like someone who's always lived like this. The way you talk, the way you carry yourself, sometimes it doesn't add up to somebody who's never had anything." Elias turned the coffee mug slowly between his hands, choosing his words with the particular care of a man walking along the edge of a truth he could not yet fully share. "I lost my father a few years back. Things fell apart after that faster than I expected in ways I didn't see coming. Sometimes a person's whole life can turn on things they never had any control over. He looked up at her. I used to have a family. A real one. I'm trying to figure out what's left of it. Something in her expression softened further, and she reached across the counter, resting her hand briefly over his not romantic, not yet just human. The simple warmth of one person acknowledging another's grief. I know something about that. My dad passed 5 years ago. Some days it still knocks the wind out of me out of nowhere like it just happened yesterday. I'm sorry. Don't be. He lived a good life. Gave away more than he kept, which used to drive my mom crazy, but I think it's the reason I loved him so much. She pulled her hand back, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small self-conscious gesture. I actually have something for you. I've been thinking about it for a few days, and I know you're going to try to argue with me, so I'd appreciate it if you'd just let me finish before you do. She disappeared into the small back office behind the kitchen, and returned a moment later holding a plain white envelope slightly worn at the corners, the kind of envelope that had clearly been opened and closed several times by someone working up the nerve to give away what was inside it. Abby, let me finish. She set the envelope on the counter in front of him but didn't let go of it right away, her hand resting on top of it as though she needed a moment longer before parting with what it contained. This is $1,200. It's everything I've managed to save over the last 2 years. I was putting it toward fixing the roof on my mom's house, but the roof can wait. It's held this long, it'll hold a little longer. She finally slid the envelope the rest of the way across the counter. I want you to take it. Get yourself a place. A real one with heat that works and a door that locks. Start over. You deserve that. Elias stared at the envelope as though it might detonate. I can't take this from you. You can, and you're going to, because I'm not asking. Her chin lifted slightly, the same quiet stubbornness he'd noticed in her the very first night she'd fed him. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I want to be really clear about that. I'm doing it because I actually believe all the way down that you're going to be okay. That whatever happened to knock you down this far, it's not the end of your story. And I'd rather help write the next part of it than just watch from the sidelines feeling bad about it. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest, the same place where Jerry's revelations had lodged like a stone 3 days earlier, shifted again, though this time with something closer to warmth than grief. He thought of his father kneeling beside frightened children in the free clinic, giving away medicine the family couldn't afford to give away, insisting every time that money could wait and people couldn't. He thought of Walter Shaw, a man he'd never met, doing the exact same thing for his own mother 15 years earlier, expecting nothing in return. And now here was Walter Shaw's daughter doing it again to the son of the man her father had once quietly saved, neither of them aware of the thread connecting all 3 of them across 15 years and 2 families. I don't know how to thank you for this, he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. You don't have to thank me. Just use it well. That's the only thing I'd ask. She smiled a little shy suddenly, as though she'd surprised even herself with the size of the gesture. And maybe once you're back on your feet, I don't know. Maybe you'd let me know how you're doing. I'd like that. I will, he said, and meant it more fully than she could possibly have understood. I promise you, Abby, I will. He left the diner a few minutes later, the envelope tucked carefully inside his coat, and walked the 4 blocks back to the rented room in a kind of stunned, grateful silence. The weight of her generosity sitting alongside the weight of everything Jerry had uncovered, grief and gratitude tangled together in a way he didn't fully know how to separate. That night he called Jerry with a request that had nothing to do with the crash investigation. I need you to find out what happened to the Shaw family's property. Walter Shaw lost land at some point before he died. I remember it in my father's old notes. Something about medical debt forcing a sale. I want it found. Bought back. Put in Abby's name quietly. No trace back to me. You're going to do this now. In the middle of everything else we've got going on. Especially now. Elias's voice was steady, resolute. She just gave me every dollar she'd saved in 2 years without a second's hesitation, Jerry. I'm not going to let that go unanswered just because I'm in the middle of something else. Find the land. Buy it back. Let her have that much at least before any of this gets more complicated than it already is. There was a pause on the line and then quieter. I'll have it done by the end of the week. Thank you. Elias looked down at the envelope on the small table beside him, still holding in its careful worn creases the shape of a kindness he intended to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. And Jerry, keep digging on my mother too. Whatever it costs. I need to know the whole truth now. All of it. I don't think I can build anything real with Abby while half my own family's story is still buried. The Thorn Health Network headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower overlooking the James River, a building Elias had not set foot in for 3 weeks, not since the night he'd handed the reins of daily operations to a chief operating officer and disappeared into a version of Richmond most of his own employees would never see. He returned that Thursday morning not as the man in the ragged coat but as himself, clean-shaven, dressed in a charcoal suit that hung slightly looser on his frame than it had a month earlier, the only visible trace of 3 weeks spent surviving on diner leftovers and borrowed sandwiches. The quarterly merger review had been scheduled for months, the acquisition of a struggling regional hospital chain in the western part of the state, a deal that would extend Thorn Health Network's reach into a dozen underserved counties, the kind of expansion his father would have approved of, for reasons that had nothing to do with market share. 12 board members sat around the long table on the 40th floor, folders open, laptops glowing, waiting for their chairman to walk them through the final terms. Elias stood at the head of the table, the city spread out gray and glittering behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, and began to speak. The acquisition brings 4 new facilities into the network, expanding coverage into 3 counties that currently have no functioning emergency department within. The words simply stopped. It happened without warning the way it always did. Now, though, this was the worst episode yet. A sudden narrowing at the edges of his vision, as though someone had begun slowly closing a curtain from both sides at once. The boardroom compressing into a tunnel of light, with darkness pressing in from every direction. The faces around the table blurred into pale, featureless smears. The floor seemed to tilt gently at first and then more insistently, and Elias's hand shot out to grip the edge of the table, missing it by an inch, before finding purchase on the second attempt. "Mr. Thorn." Someone's voice, sharp with alarm, cutting through the sudden ringing in his ears. "Elias, are you all right?" He tried to answer and found that the words wouldn't assemble properly, his mouth moving around a sentence his brain could no longer complete. The darkness at the edges of his vision continued its slow, terrible advance, and for one disorienting, panicked moment he genuinely believed he might be about to lose his sight, entirely right there in front of 12 members of his own board, in the same room where his father's portrait hung on the far wall, watching. "Someone call for help. I'm fine." The words came out slurred, unconvincing even to his own ears. He lowered himself carefully into his chair, both hands braced against the table, breathing slowly through the nausea rising in his throat. "Just give me a moment." It was not a moment. It was nearly 4 minutes before his vision began gradually and incompletely to return, the boardroom swimming back into focus at the edges, first faces resolving out of the blur one by one, though a persistent gray haze remained at the periphery of everything, refusing entirely to clear. By the time Jerry arrived, summoned by a panicked call from the head of the executive assistant pool, the board meeting had been adjourned, and Elias sat alone in his private office, blinds drawn, one hand pressed against his closed eyes. "I'm taking you to see Dr. Alvarez right now," Jerry said, not asking. No arguments. There were no arguments. Something in the finality of what had just happened in that boardroom had stripped away Elias's usual instinct to minimize, to push through, to insist on his own resilience the way he had insisted on it through every hard year since the accident. He let Jerry drive him across town to the private ophthalmology practice that had monitored his condition quietly for over a decade, and he sat in the small examination room afterward, with a kind of hollowed-out stillness, while Dr. Miriam Alvarez reviewed the results of a scan that had taken less than 20 minutes to complete and would take considerably longer to fully absorb. "The retinitis pigmentosa has progressed significantly since your last exam, Doctor," Alvarez said, her voice gentle but unflinching, the tone of a physician who had learned long ago that patients deserve the truth, delivered plainly without unnecessary softening. "Faster than the typical progression for your genetic profile, which tells me something accelerated it. Have you experienced any additional head trauma in the last several months? Any blow to the skull, even a minor one?" Elias thought of 3 weeks of sleeping on concrete, of a body pushed past its limits, but nothing that matched what she was describing. "No, nothing recent." "What about historically? You mentioned a car accident years ago during our first consultation. Head injury sustained during that event?" "Yes." His voice came out flat. "Severe concussion. Some swelling the doctors were concerned about at the time." Dr. Alvarez nodded slowly, making a note. "That would explain a great deal. In cases where retinitis pigmentosa exists as a dormant genetic condition, a significant traumatic brain injury can act as a trigger, accelerating what might otherwise have remained latent for decades or never manifested with real severity. At all. It's not uncommon, though it's rarely discussed." because most patients with your genetic markers never experience the kind of trauma severe enough to trigger it this dramatically. She set down her pen. Elias, I want to be honest with you because I think you'd rather hear it plainly than have me soften it. Your peripheral vision has narrowed considerably over the past several months. At the current rate of progression, you should expect continued deterioration. I can't give you a precise timeline for how much sight you'll retain, or for how long, but I want you preparing now practically and emotionally for the possibility of significant vision loss within the coming years, rather than treating this as a distant hypothetical. The words settled into the room with a terrible quiet finality. Elias sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, absorbing them the way a man absorbs news he has on some buried level, already suspected for a long time, but never allowed himself to fully examine. The cane, he thought distantly. The dark glasses he'd worn for 3 weeks as a disguise, moving through the city pretending to be a blind man begging for scraps of kindness. He had chosen that particular disguise, almost without thinking, reaching instinctively for the persona that felt on some level he hadn't examined closely enough, less like performance and more like rehearsal. A quiet, terrible truth surfaced in him now, one he had perhaps always known and simply refused to name. He had not been pretending to lose his sight. He had been practicing, however, unconsciously for a future that was already irreversibly arriving. How long, he asked quietly, before its total? I can't answer that with any certainty, and I won't pretend otherwise. Every case is different. Some patients retain functional vision for decades. Others progress faster. Doctor, Alvarez's voice softened. What I can tell you is that the trigger, the accident all those years ago, wasn't something you did or something you could have prevented. Whatever's happening now was set in motion the night that car went off the road. You've simply been living inside its slow unfolding ever since, whether you knew it or not. Jerry, who had said nothing throughout the entire consultation, sitting quietly in the corner chair with his hands clasped between his knees, finally spoke, his voice rough with something he was working hard to keep controlled. The truck that hit them, the one Whitmore's company sent that night. He looked at Dr. Alvarez, then at Elias. It's not just responsible for the crash anymore. It's responsible for this too. For everything that's happening to your eyes right now, all these years later. Elias closed his eyes, the small gesture, carrying a new and terrible weight, now that he understood fully what darkness behind his own eyelids might eventually mean. Somewhere in the quiet of the examination room, the full shape of what had been taken from him, not just that single night 15 years ago, but everything unfolding slowly ever since, a debt still accruing interest across a decade and a half, settled into him with a clarity he could no longer look away from. Then it isn't only my father's death I need answers for, he said, finally opening his eyes, his voice steady despite everything. It's my own future. Whatever's left of my sight, however many years I have left to see the people I love that was taken from me too, the same night by the same men. And I intend to make certain they understand exactly what they cost me before this is finished. Jerry did not go home after leaving the ophthalmologist's office. He drove instead, without entirely deciding to, toward 23rd Street, parking across from Miller's Diner, and sitting behind the wheel for nearly 10 minutes before he found the resolve to go inside. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Abby looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting immediately from polite welcome to careful concern the moment she registered his face. "You're Eli's friend," she said, slowly setting down the coffee pot. "I've seen you drop him off a couple times at the corner. You never come in, though, Jerry." He extended a hand, and she shook it, still watching him with the particular wariness of someone who has learned to read trouble before it fully announces itself. "Do you have a few minutes? I need to talk to you about something, and I owe you an apology first before I get to the rest of it." She glanced toward the kitchen where an older woman, Mrs. Whitfield, presumably was visible through the pass-through window, then untied her apron and gestured toward a booth near the back. "I've got 15 minutes before the dinner rush. Talk fast." Jerry sat across from her, folding his hands on the table, choosing his words with the care of a man who had spent 15 years protecting someone and was now for the first time about to hand a piece of that protection over to a stranger. "I've been watching you for the past few weeks, following you a little, checking into your background, your job, your family, your finances. I want to tell you that myself before you find out some other way, because you deserve better than finding out secondhand." Abby's expression cooled instantly, her arms crossing over her chest. "You've been investigating me." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "And I owe you an apology because I was wrong to assume the worst about you before I ever gave you the chance to just be who you are. I've known Eli a long time, longer than you'd guess. And I've watched people circle him before people who smell money or opportunity or something to take, and they get close and then they take it. I've had to clean up after that more times than I can count. So when he started talking about a woman at a diner who fed him without asking questions, my first instinct wasn't hope. It was suspicion. I'm sorry for that. You didn't deserve it. Abby was quiet for a moment, studying him, some of the coldness in her expression giving way to something more uncertain. Why are you telling me this now? Because I was wrong, and because something happened today that made it clear I don't have the luxury of being cautious with you anymore. I need someone in his corner who isn't me, who isn't paid to protect him, who genuinely cares about him for reasons that have nothing to do with anything he can offer you. Jerry exhaled slowly, and for the first time since he'd sat down, something in his composed exterior cracked just slightly, revealing the exhaustion underneath. Eli isn't his real name. I think you might already suspect that. I've suspected a lot of things, Abby said carefully. I never pushed because it wasn't my business unless he wanted it to be. That's exactly why I'm telling you now. Because you never pushed. Jerry leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. He's going blind, Abby. Slowly over years, but it's accelerating now, and today it got significantly worse. There was an accident a long time ago. Someone deliberately ran his family off the road when he was 19 years old, and it triggered a genetic eye condition that's been quietly stealing his sight ever since. I've protected that secret for 15 years. I've protected him from people who would use it against him, exploit him. That's my whole life, really, when you get down to it. Making sure the people around him don't hurt him worse than the world already has. Abby's hand had gone to her mouth, her eyes bright with sudden tears. She was visibly fighting to hold back. He's really going blind. Gradually. Not all at once. But yes, Jerry's voice roughened. And I watched him for 3 weeks walk through this city pretending to be exactly what he's actually becoming, testing strangers to see if any of them would treat him with basic human decency, if he had absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Do you understand how many people failed that test, Abby? How many people he used to call friends looked straight through him, or worse, filmed him, mocked him, laughed at him? You were the only one. In 3 weeks in an entire city, you were the only person who simply fed a stranger because he looked hungry and never once asked what you'd get out of it. Tears slipped freely down Abby's face now, and she wiped at them quickly, embarrassed, glancing toward the kitchen to make sure Mrs. Whitfield wasn't watching. I didn't do anything special. Her voice broke. I just did what my dad taught me to do. I never thought. She stopped, shaking her head slowly, something dawning in her expression. That's it, isn't it? That's why you were investigating me. It's not just about protecting him from strangers. There's something about my family specifically. Jerry hesitated, weighing how much was his to tell, then decided that after everything he'd already revealed, half measures would only feel like another betrayal. Your father treated his mother years ago at your family's free clinic right after the accident I mentioned. Free of charge, no questions asked, at a time when the Thorns had nothing left to give anyone. Eli didn't know that when he first walked into your diner. He found out afterward by accident, going through old records. Your father's kindness to a frightened, broke, terrified young mother 15 years ago is part of the reason his family survived that year at all. Abby pressed both hands to her face, overwhelmed the pieces of the last several weeks, rearranging themselves rapidly into a shape she hadn't seen coming. My dad never mentioned anything about that. He never mentioned any of his patients by name, client, confidentiality, he always said, even at the dinner table, even years later. She lowered her hands slowly, her eyes finding Jerry's again, something fierce and protective rising up through the grief and shock. Is he safe? Whoever did this to his family, are they still out there? Is he in danger right now? I'm working on that, Jerry said carefully. That's part of why I needed to talk to you today, actually. I need you to understand that the man courting your family's approval, Grant Whitmore, his family, may be directly connected to what happened to Eli's family 15 years ago. I don't have full proof yet, but if I'm right, your mother is about to marry your sister into the very family responsible for nearly destroying the man you've been feeding sandwiches to for 3 weeks. Abby went very pale, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Oh my God. I need you to keep this to yourself for now. Not your mother, not your sister, not anyone. Give me a little more time to get this right, to have proof strong enough that nobody can deny it or bury it. Can you do that? She nodded slowly, still absorbing the weight of everything he'd told her, and then quietly asked the question that seemed to matter more to her than any of the rest of it. Is he okay? Right now, today, after whatever happened with his eyes? He's scared, Jerry admitted, some of his own composure slipping. I've known him 15 years, and I've never seen him scared the way he was in that doctor's office today. He spent his whole adult life being the strong one, the one everyone else leans on. I don't think he knows how to let anyone see him frightened. Except I think maybe you." Abby wiped her eyes one final time, straightened her shoulders, and looked at Jerry with a resolve that mirrored in that moment something of her father's old unshakable certainty. Then he shouldn't have to be strong alone anymore. "Tell him no. Don't tell him anything. I'll tell him myself." She stood untying the apron she'd only half retied, glancing toward the kitchen. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to take an early break." Jerry watched her go, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door, moving with the same unhesitating decisiveness she'd shown the very first night she'd fed a stranger without asking his name, and something in his chest, the old, practiced wariness of 15 years spent protecting his best friend from a world that too often failed to deserve him, finally quietly began to loosen. Abby found Elias exactly where Jerry had directed her, sitting alone on a bench near the small community garden 2 blocks from the rented room, the streetlights just beginning to flicker on overhead, his cane resting against his knee, his shoulders curved inward with an exhaustion that seemed to reach far past physical tiredness. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, startled, half rising before she reached him, and something in his face caught unguarded. Before he could arrange it into its usual careful composure, told her everything Jerry had described was true. "Abby." Her name came out rough, uncertain. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer with words. She simply sat down beside him on the bench, and after a moment's hesitation reached over and took his hand, holding it firmly the way a person holds on to something they've decided not to let go of. "I know," she said quietly. "About your eyes. About the accident. About my dad." Her voice caught. "About all of it." He closed his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The evening settled around them, quiet and gray, the last of the daylight fading behind the rooftops. When he finally opened his eyes again, something in them had shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular loosening that comes when a burden long carried alone is finally, however, briefly shared. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said. "I don't care how I found out. I care that you've been carrying all of it by yourself." She squeezed his hand. "You don't have to be strong every second, you know. Not with me." They sat together as the streetlights fully came on, saying little else, the silence between them carrying more than either of them could have put into words. It was not Elias understood the end of anything. Jerry's investigation was far from finished. The truth about his mother still unresolved, Grant Whitmore's family still walking free with 15 years of unaccounted cruelty behind them. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel entirely alone in carrying it. A few days later, the Shaw house filled with the particular tension of an evening arranged for the sole purpose of impressing someone who had not yet arrived. Diane had spent the better part of the afternoon polishing the good silverware, the set that only ever emerged from the sideboard for Thanksgiving, and now apparently for the courtship of a Whitmore. The table had been set with a white cloth Abby didn't recognize, purchased, she suspected specifically for the occasion. Candles flickered in mismatched holders arranged to look intentional. The whole house smelled of roast chicken and the lavender lotion Diane wore when she wanted badly for an evening to go well. "You'll wear the blue dress," Diane said for the 3rd time that day, adjusting a stray curl at Abby's temple with fingers that trembled slightly, whether from nerves or hope Abby couldn't tell. "And you'll smile. That's all I'm asking. One evening, Abby. Smile, be polite, let the man see how lovely you are. You don't have to marry him tomorrow. Mom, I already told you. I heard what you told me." Diane's voice sharpened, then softened, just as quickly, exhaustion bleeding through the forced brightness of the evening. "I heard you, and I understand you more than you probably think I do. But I need you to understand me too, just this once. I am tired, Abby. I am so tired of watching you and your sister struggle for things that shouldn't be struggles. I want more than anything in this world for one evening to go easily for this family. Please, give me that much." The doorbell rang before Abby could answer, and Diane's face transformed instantly, exhaustion swallowed whole by a bright, determined hostess's smile as she hurried to answer it. Grant Whitmore stepped into the house wearing a navy sport coat that fit him with the particular ease of expensive tailoring, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of white roses, his smile wide and practiced in a way that made something in Abby's stomach tighten with instinctive discomfort. "Mrs. Shaw, you have a beautiful home." His gaze swept the small living room, lingering a half-second too long on the worn edges of the furniture, before landing on Abby with an appreciative smile that felt more like an assessment than genuine warmth. "And Abigail, you're even lovelier than my father described. Grant, please come in, sit down." Diane fussed over him, taking his coat, arranging him at the head of the table with the eager solicitude of a woman auditioning her whole family for a role she desperately wanted them to win. Dinner proceeded the way Abby had expected it would, Grant discussing real estate ventures with easy confidence, dropping the names of developments and dollar figures the way other people mentioned the weather, while Diane laughed a little too readily at each remark. And Kayla, seated across the table, watched the whole performance with an expression Abby couldn't quite read, somewhere between envy and unease. "You're very quiet," Abigail, Grant said, eventually turning his attention fully toward her, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I hear you work at a diner. That must be interesting." "It's honest work," Abby said evenly. "I like the people there." "Of course." He waved a hand, dismissive despite the polite words. "I don't like to wait, for the things I want. I find life goes better when you simply decide what you want and pursue it directly." His eyes lingered on her again, and Abby felt, not for the first time that evening, an instinctive urge to put more distance between them than the length of the dinner table currently allowed. "I already have someone I care about, Grant." The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, quiet but clear. "I should have said that from the start. I'm sorry if that wasn't made clear to you beforehand." The table went silent. Diane's fork clattered against her plate. "Abigail." "It's fine, Mrs. Shaw." Grant's smile stayed fixed in place, though something colder moved behind his eyes now. "I've heard about your friend, the one from the diner. I understand he's had some difficulties recently." The way he said difficulties carried an edge Abby didn't like at all. "Abigail Rose Shaw." Diane's voice rose sharp with mortification, all pretense of hospitality abandoning her at once. "You will not embarrass this family at my table. Not tonight. Not with the Whitmores." Her face had flushed dark, red, her hands trembling now visibly around her napkin. "Do you have any idea what I have sacrificed to give you a chance at a life better than mine? Do you have any—" She stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her chest, her face draining suddenly of all color. The napkin slipped from her fingers. Mom Kayla was on her feet, first alarm cutting through whatever resentment had colored her expression moments earlier. "Mom, what's wrong?" Diane's breathing had gone shallow and quick, her lips taking on a faint bluish tinge, and she swayed once in her chair before Kayla caught her, easing her gently toward the floor as panic erupted around the table. Grant standing frozen, phone fumbling uselessly in his hands. Abby dropping to her knees beside her mother with a terror that stole her voice entirely. It was in that chaos, amid Diane's ragged breathing and Kayla's frightened sobbing and Grant's useless hovering, that the front door opened without a knock, and Elias Kane, set aside moving with sudden unmistakable purpose, crossed the room and knelt beside Diane Shaw, 2 fingers already pressed against her wrist, his voice dropping into a calm, commanding register. None of them had ever heard from him before. "Someone call 911 now. Kayla, I need you to help me get her legs elevated gently right now. Abby, stay close to her, keep talking to her, she needs to hear a familiar voice." His hands moved with a precision that belonged to no ordinary bystander, checking her pulse, tilting her chin, monitoring her breathing with the unmistakable competence of someone who had spent years around exactly this kind of emergency. "Diane, can you hear me? You're going to be all right. Help is coming. Just breathe with me, slow and steady." Grant Whitmore stood frozen at the edge of the room, watching a man he had mocked without ever knowing his name move through a medical crisis with a calm, practiced authority that made absolutely no sense for a homeless stranger, and something in his expression beneath the shock flickered briefly with the first uneasy suspicion that the evening's humiliations were far from finished. The ambulance carried Diane Shaw to Thorne Memorial Hospital, the flagship facility of the very network whose chairman had 20 minutes earlier kept her alive on her own dining room floor. Abby rode in the back beside the paramedics, gripping her mother's hand, while Kayla followed behind in the car with Grant, whose earlier composure had entirely dissolved into a tense, watchful silence he did not attempt to explain. Elias arrived separately in a car. Jerry drove without being asked, and by the time he walked through the emergency department doors, Kane left behind, now the disguise abandoned in the urgency of the moment. Though most of the staff on shift that evening had no reason yet to recognize their own chairman in the exhausted, unshaven man moving quickly through the corridor, Diane had already been stabilized. Her condition diagnosed as a severe anxiety-induced cardiac episode, compounded by exhaustion and long untreated hypertension. Not fatal, not yet dangerous, but serious enough that the attending physician recommended overnight observation. "She's going to be all right," Abby said, finding Elias in the waiting area outside the cardiac unit, her voice still shaking from the residual adrenaline of the evening. "They said you probably saved her life. That if you hadn't known what to do." She stopped, studying his face more closely now, some new question forming behind her eyes. "Where did you learn to do that? What you did tonight, that wasn't luck." That was training. Later, he said, gently squeezing her hand. I'll explain everything to you, I promise. Just not tonight. Not while you're still shaking. She nodded, accepting it, and they sat together in the waiting room for nearly an hour, until a nurse came to tell them Diane was resting, and visitors could see her briefly, one at a time. It was during that hour, while Abby dozed fitfully against his shoulder, and Jerry paced the corridor making quiet phone calls, that Elias rose to find a vending machine needing coffee badly enough to brave the hospital's terrible version of it, and turned down a service corridor. He knew, intimately from 100 board tours and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, a corridor that at this hour was nearly empty, except for a cleaning cart parked outside a supply closet, and kneeling beside it, an older woman in a gray custodial uniform mopping methodically at a floor that didn't especially need it. She looked up as he approached, and the mop slipped from her hands, clattering against the tile. For a long suspended moment, neither of them moved. Elias stood frozen in the fluorescent light of the empty corridor, staring at a face that had aged 15 years since he'd last seen it. Deeper lines around the eyes, hair gone, mostly gray, shoulders rounded now with the particular stoop of a body that had spent years bending over mop buckets and cleaning carts. But the eyes themselves, wide now with something between terror and disbelief, had not changed at all. He would have known them anywhere. He had spent 19 years looking into eyes exactly like his own. Mom. The word came out broken, disbelieving, and the woman before him made a small strangled sound and turned to flee, abandoning the cart, entirely moving down the corridor with a speed that belied her age. Elias caught up to her in 6 strides, his hand closing gently around her arm. Please, he said, his voice cracking wide open. Please don't run. I've been told for 15 years that you were gone, that you died. I buried a version of you in my heart a long time ago, and I need to understand how you're standing here in front of me right now, alive, wearing a hospital uniform, working in a building with my own name on it. She stopped struggling, her whole body seeming to collapse inward, and when she finally turned to face him, fully tears streaming down a face lined with 15 years of grief he had known nothing about, she said, "Only I'm so sorry, Elias. I'm so sorry." They sat together in an empty conference room down the hall, Jerry summoned by a single urgent phone call standing guard at the door, while Margaret Doyle, she had changed her name, she explained, in those first terrible weeks needing to disappear as completely as the men who'd threatened her. Family had demanded, told her son a truth that unraveled 15 years of grief in the space of 20 minutes. They came to the hospital 3 days after the accident while your father was still in shock and you were barely conscious in the ICU. Her voice shook, but she forced herself through it as though she had rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in her head over the years and needed finally to say it aloud. 2 men. They didn't threaten me directly, they were too careful for that. They simply told me that the Whitmore family had significant resources, significant reach, and that if certain people didn't stop asking questions about a certain truck and a certain night, there might be a second accident, one that wouldn't leave survivors this time. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. They said if I disappeared, if I simply vanished, let your father believe I'd left him. Let you believe I'd died rather than abandoned you, because a mother's death is easier for a child to forgive than a mother's choice to leave. The threats would stop. Your father would be safe. You would be safe. They gave me money, enough to start over somewhere far away under a new name, and made it very clear what would happen if I ever tried to make contact again. You believed them. Elias's voice was hollow, disbelieving. I believed that a truck had already tried to kill my entire family once, and I could not risk finding out if they meant it a second time. Margaret's tears came harder now. I told myself it was the only way to protect you both. I told myself that every single day for 15 years, and some days I even managed to believe it. I moved to Ohio first, then came back to Virginia 8 years ago, because I couldn't stay away any longer, and I took this job cleaning floors in your hospital, Elias, in the building your father built, and you expanded because it was the only way I could think of to be near you, without breaking my promise to disappear. I've watched you from a distance for 8 years. I've read every article. I stood in the back of the crowd at your father's funeral veiled, and no one recognized me. I have watched you become an extraordinary man, and I have never once in 15 years believed I deserved to be part of the life you built. Elias sat in silence for a long moment, the full weight of it settling into him, not just the crash, not just his failing sight, but the entire architecture of his family's suffering, deliberately engineered by men who had wanted a piece, too, of land, badly enough to destroy a mother, a father, and a Prostand, 19-year-old boy's future in a single night. and then quietly continued extracting payment from that destruction for 15 years afterward, in the form of a mother's forced absence and a son's grief for a death that had never actually happened. "You should have come to me," he said finally, his voice raw. "The moment I was old enough, powerful enough to protect you myself, you should have come to me. I was ashamed." Margaret's voice broke completely now. "Ashamed that I'd left even for the reasons I told myself were good ones. Ashamed that you'd grown up believing I was dead instead of simply gone. I didn't know how to walk back into your life and explain any of it without you hating me for the years I stole from both of us." Elias reached across the table and took his mother's hand, thin, now roughened by years of manual labor, trembling still, and held it the way he had once as a small boy held it crossing busy streets, trusting completely that she would keep him safe. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "I spent 15 years missing a woman I thought was dead, finding out she was alive and frightened and protecting me the entire time from a distance that isn't something to hate, Mom. That's something to grieve together, and then finally put down." His voice steadied resolve, settling over the grief like a second skin. "The Whitmores took 15 years from both of us. My sight, my father's heart, your entire life, hidden away in the shadow of a threat that should never have been able to reach either of us for this long. That ends now. All of it. I promise you that." Dawn found Elias still sitting in the small hospital conference room, his mother finally asleep on the small vinyl couch against the wall, exhaustion having overtaken 15 years of vigilance all at once, now that the vigilance itself was no longer necessary. Jerry sat across the table, a laptop open in front of him, quietly assembling the pieces of everything they now knew into something that might finally hold up in a courtroom rather than only in the private, devastating clarity of a family's shared grief. "I need everything cross-referenced by tonight," Elias said quietly, watching his mother's chest rise and fall in sleep, still only half believing she was real, that he could reach out and touch her shoulder, and she would still there. "The shell companies, the truck registration, the disbursement records, whatever Margaret can add now that she's willing to speak. I want it airtight before I say a single word publicly. I've already started pulling threads from what your mother told us." Jerry didn't look up from the screen, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. The men who approached her at the hospital, she remembers a company name stitched onto one of their jackets. Whitmore Security Consulting. Dissolved 9 years ago, but dissolved companies still leave a paper trail if you know where to dig, and I know exactly where to dig now. He finally glanced up, his expression grim but focused. "This isn't just a wrongful injury case anymore, Elias. Threatening a grieving mother into abandoning her family to protect a real estate deal. That's coercion. That's conspiracy that potentially opens up federal charges depending on how far the money trail runs. This is bigger than land deals now. This is a 15-year cover-up." Elias nodded slowly, though his attention kept drifting back to his mother's sleeping face, to the deep lines. 15 years of quiet suffering had etched there, lines that belonged, he understood now, as much to the Whitmores' cruelty as any of his own scars did. He found Abby an hour later back in the cardiac unit's family waiting area, curled uncomfortably in a vinyl chair beside her mother's room, having refused to go home despite Kayla's repeated urging. She startled awake when he touched her shoulder, blinking against the fluorescent light, and something in his face must have told her immediately that the night had brought more than just her mother's medical crisis, because she sat up, fully alert now, searching his expression. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have." He sat down beside her, taking her hand, and told her everything. His mother, the corridor, the 15 years of forced silence, the threats that had shaped both their families in ways neither of them had fully understood until last night. He watched her absorb it in stages, shock giving way to horror, horror giving way to a fierce, protective anger that reminded him not for the first time of the particular strength beneath her gentleness. "She's been alive this whole time," Abby said finally, her voice hushed with disbelief. "Working in this hospital, watching you from a distance for 8 years, and never once." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "God, Eli, I'm so sorry. I can't even imagine what that's doing to you right now on top of everything else." "I don't fully know what it's doing to me yet," he admitted, and it was the truest thing he'd said in weeks. "I think I'm still somewhere underneath the shock of it, but I know I'm not carrying it alone this time, and that matters more than I think I ever understood before I met you." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the hum of the hospital's early morning quiet. Two people who had each in their own way spent years learning to carry impossible weights without complaint, now discovering what it felt like to finally set some of that weight down in the presence of someone who wouldn't flinch from it. "There's something else," Elias said. eventually his voice dropping lower. Something I need to tell you now before this goes any further, because I don't want you finding out from anyone but me, and I don't want to wait another day to say it. Abby lifted her head, searching his face. My name isn't Eli, he said quietly. It's Elias. Elias Thorne. He watched the recognition move slowly across her face, confusion first, then a dawning, disbelieving understanding, as the name settled into place against everything else she'd learned in the past week. I'm the chairman of Thorne Health Network. This hospital, the one that just saved your mother's life, it's mine. My father built the first clinic. It grew out of the same one where your father treated my mother for free, 15 years ago, before either of our families knew the other existed. Abby went very still, her hand tightening slightly in his, though she didn't pull away. You've had money this whole time. All those weeks. The coat, the sleeping outside the... She shook her head slowly, not with anger exactly, but with the effort of restructuring an entire understanding of a man she'd already come to care for deeply. Why? Why would you put yourself through all of that when you didn't have to? Because I needed to find out if kindness like yours still existed in the world, freely given without any expectation of return. My father believed it did all the way to the end of his life, and I'd started to lose that belief entirely after he died. Elias held her gaze steady despite the vulnerability in his voice. I found you 4 blocks from a rented room I paid for in cash under a false name, and you fed me soup without asking a single question. And it turned out completely by accident, completely without either of us knowing that your father had already saved my mother's life once before 15 years earlier. The same quiet, unconditional way you fed a stranger who looked hungry. I wasn't lying to you about who I am inside, Abby. I was only lying about what I own. She was quiet for a long moment, processing, her eyes bright with unshed tears that seemed to carry both hurt and understanding in equal measure. You should have told me sooner. I know. But I understand why you didn't. Her voice softened, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. I think if I'm honest, I'd rather have fallen for the man in the ragged coat who had nothing and find out later he had everything than the other way around. At least this way I know it was real. What I felt for you, it was never about anything you could give me. I know that now more certainly than I've known almost anything in my life. He lifted her hand and pressed it gently to his lips, an old-fashioned gesture that felt in that fluorescent hospital corridor, entirely natural between them. There's more you need to know, though, before any of this goes further. Grant Whitmore's family, his father specifically, is responsible for what happened to my family 15 years ago. The accident, my sight, my mother's disappearance. All of it traces back to his family's determination to force my father off a piece of land he refused to sell. I have proof now, or I will very soon, and I intend to make certain publicly and completely that the truth comes out. Abby's face hardened, the softness of a moment ago giving way to something fiercer. He's downstairs right now. Grant. He's been hovering around my mother's room half the night like he still thinks he's marrying into this family. Let him hover a little longer, Elias said quietly, something resolute settling into his voice. There's a gala in 5 days, Thorne Health Network's annual benefit, the biggest fundraising event of the year for the hospital system. Every major donor, half the city's business leaders, and as it happens, the Whitmore family who've sat at my table every year for the past decade, pretending to care about the causes they've spent 15 years quietly undermining. He turned to face her fully, his expression steady despite the storm gathering behind it. I want you there, Abby, not as a guest. As the woman standing beside me when I finally stop hiding, and when the truth about the Whitmores finally becomes impossible for anyone in this city to ignore. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then slowly nodded, some of her father's old unshakable resolve settling visibly into her own posture. Then let's finish this. Together. Down the hall through the narrow window of her hospital room, Diane Shaw slept on, unaware that the quiet foundations of her entire understanding of the world, who deserved trust, who deserved contempt, who her daughter had truly fallen in love with, were about to be rebuilt from the ground up in front of the whole city in 5 days' time. The grand ballroom of the Jefferson Hotel filled slowly through the early evening crystal chandeliers, throwing warm light across round tables draped in ivory linen, a string quartet playing softly near the far wall while waitstaff moved silently between clusters of Richmond's wealthiest families. 500 guests had been seated for the Thorne Health Network annual benefit, the largest turnout in the gala's history, drawn in part by weeks of quiet speculation in the local business press about their reclusive chairman's sudden, unexplained absence from public life. Diane Shaw sat near the front of the room, released from the hospital only 2 days earlier. still pale but insistent on attending, dressed in a borrowed gown that fit a little loosely at the shoulders. Grant Whitmore had arranged the seating himself, positioning her beside him at his family's table, with a solicitous attentiveness that had not wavered since the night of her collapse, refilling her water glass, asking after her health, with a concern that Abby, seated 2 chairs down, found increasingly difficult to watch without her jaw tightening. "You look lovely tonight, Mrs. Shaw," Grant said, leaning toward Diane with his easy, practiced smile. "I do hope the unpleasantness at dinner the other night hasn't left any lasting impression. These things happen in families. I'd hate for it to color anything between us going forward." "You're very gracious, Grant." Diane's voice carried genuine warmth, entirely unaware of what Abby now knew about the man's family, what Elias had asked her to withhold gently but firmly until the evening had run its course. "I only wish Abigail could see how much you, Mom." Abby's voice was quiet but firm enough to interrupt. "Not tonight." At the head table, Grant's father, Richard Whitmore, sat in expansive good humor, holding court among a cluster of city councilmen and hospital board members, his laughter carrying easily across the room, a man entirely at ease in a life built, unbeknownst to nearly everyone present, on a foundation, buried cruelty. Jerry stood near the ballroom's side entrance, earpiece in place, watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who had spent the last several days coordinating with federal investigators, hospital counsel, and a forensic accountant who had finally traced the last shell company back to, in its source. He caught Elias's eye across the room and gave a single small nod. The lights dimmed slightly as the evening's program began, and the hospital's chief development officer stepped to the podium to open the formal remarks, thanking donors, reviewing the year's expansion into underserved counties, building toward the traditional highlight of the evening, remarks from the chairman himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the development officer said, "please join me in welcoming the chairman of Thorn Health Network." The doors at the rear of the ballroom opened. Elias walked in without a cane this time, dressed in a dark suit that fit him exactly as it should, his bearing entirely different from the stooped, careful posture he had worn through weeks on the street. And yet, as he moved down the center aisle toward the stage, several guests near the front rose, halfway from their seats in visible shock, recognizing in his face the same features that had appeared mocked and filmed in a video that had circulated quietly through certain corners of the city weeks earlier. Bradley Cole, seated near the bar with a drink already in hand, went the color of old paper. Elias climbed the short steps to the stage and stood at the podium, letting the murmur of recognition ripple through the room before he spoke, his gaze finding Abby's face in the crowd and holding there for a steadying moment before he began. 6 weeks ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "I disappeared from public life. Some of you speculated about a health crisis. Others assumed a corporate scandal or simply eccentricity. The truth is considerably harder to explain and considerably more important than either." He paused. "I spent 6 weeks living on the streets of this city disguised as a homeless man, because I needed to remember something my father tried to teach me my whole life, and that I had somewhere along the way begun to forget, that compassion cannot be measured by a balance sheet, and that a person's worth has nothing to do with what they can offer you in return." A ripple of uneasy silence moved through the room. Richard Whitmore's easy smile had begun almost imperceptibly to falter. "During those 6 weeks, exactly one person in this city treated me with unconditional kindness without knowing who I was or what I had, expecting absolutely nothing in return." Elias's eyes found Abby again, and this time he did not look away. "Her name is Abigail Shaw. She fed me when I had nothing. She gave me the entirety of her savings, believing she was helping a stranger start over. And in the process of getting to know her, I discovered something neither of us could have anticipated, that her late father, Dr. Walter Shaw, once treated my mother for free 15 years ago during the worst month of my family's life, at a time when we had nothing left to offer anyone either." Diane Shaw's hand rose slowly to her mouth, tears already gathering the shape of the last several weeks, rearranging itself rapidly in her understanding. "But there is a second truth I need this room to hear tonight." Elias's voice hardened, the warmth of a moment ago giving way to something colder, more deliberate. 15 years ago, my family was run off a rural highway by a commercial truck that struck our vehicle deliberately and left the scene without stopping. That crash caused the heart condition that eventually killed my father and triggered a genetic eye disease that has been slowly stealing my vision ever since. It was not an accident. It was ordered, paid for in cash through a dissolved shell company by a man who wanted my father to sell a piece of land that housed a free medical clinic for the poor, and who was willing to nearly kill an entire family rather than accept no for an answer. The ballroom had gone entirely silent now, 500 guests. Frozen mid-motion glasses, halfway raised forks stilled above plates. That same man's associates threatened my mother in a hospital corridor 3 days after the crash, and coerced her into disappearing from our lives entirely for 15 years under threat of further violence, so that neither my father nor I would ever ask further questions about that night. Elias's voice caught just slightly before steadying again. My mother is here tonight, alive. After 15 years I was told she was dead. He gestured, and from the side of the stage Margaret Doyle walked forward, dressed simply but with her head held high, her hand trembling only slightly, as she took her place beside her son. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened again, and this time it was not a guest who entered but 4 federal investigators in plain dark suits moving purposefully down the side aisle toward the Whitmore family's table, where Richard Whitmore had gone entirely white, half risen from his chair, and Grant sat frozen, his charm finally completely abandoning him. Richard Whitmore, the lead investigator, said low but audible in the church silent room, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction, and coercion in connection with a vehicular assault 15 years ago, and for threats made against Margaret Doyle Thorne in the course of concealing that." Krimi. Chaos broke gently across the ballroom. Gasps, murmured disbelief, chairs scraping, as guests turned to watch the Whitmore family led toward the exit, Richard protesting his innocence in a voice that had lost all its earlier ease. Grant sitting motionless, staring at the tablecloth as though it might offer some explanation for how thoroughly his evening and his family's fortune had just collapsed. Diane Shaw sat frozen at the abandoned table, tears streaming freely, now staring up at the stage where her daughter's homeless friend stood, revealed as both a billionaire and somehow impossibly connected to her late husband's quiet, unpaid kindness 15 years earlier. Elias stepped down from the stage, crossed the silent, staring ballroom, and stopped directly in front of Abby, extending his hand. "I told you I'd stop hiding," he said quietly, the entire room watching now, 500 witnesses to a truth that had taken 15 years and 6 impossible weeks to finally come into the light. "Everything I have belongs to a debt I can never fully repay to your family. But I'd like to try, Abby. For the rest of my life, however much of it I have left to see you clearly, I'd like to try." The days that followed, the gala moved with the strange, suspended quality of a life reassembling itself after an earthquake, familiar shapes returning but never quite settling back into their original places. Richard Whitmore remained in federal custody, denied bail as prosecutors built a case that had grown in the week since the ballroom's chaos, to include 3 additional witnesses willing to testify about the company's pattern of place intimidation stretching back nearly 2 decades. Grant Whitmore, stripped of the family fortune, now frozen under federal investigation, disappeared from Richmond society entirely. His engagement plans dissolved along with everything else his name had once guaranteed him. At Thorne Memorial Hospital, in the modest administrative wing on the 3rd floor, Elias sat across a desk from his general counsel, signing the final paperwork on a project that had occupied every spare hour since the night in that empty conference room. The Walter Shaw Memorial Scholarship Fund would provide full tuition for the next 20 years and beyond to promising medical students from low-income families across the Commonwealth of Virginia, with priority given to students committed to returning after their training to serve in underserved rural communities, exactly like the one where a young Dr. Shaw had once quietly saved a frightened stranger's life, for nothing but the satisfaction of having done right by her. The old clinic building itself, the one that had stood at the center of everything, the land the Whitmores had tried and failed to steal, the place where 2 families' fates had first invisibly intertwined, 15 years before either of them knew it had been fully restored. Fresh paint, new windows, a small brass plaque beside the door that read simply, "In memory of Dr. Walter Shaw and Robert Thorne, who believed that people mattered more than money could ever measure." Margaret Doyle Thorne moved into the guest house on her son's property that same month, though she insisted gently but firmly on keeping her job at the hospital at least part-time. "I spent 8 years finding purpose in that work," she told Elias one evening, the 2 of them sitting together on the back porch as the sun set over the James River, something neither of them had been able to do together in 15 years. "I'm not ready to give all of it up just because I don't have to hide anymore." Diane Shaw, for her part, needed longer to fully absorb what had happened, not just the revelation of Elias's identity, but the shape of her own misjudgments laid bare in front of the whole city. She sat with Abby one quiet evening on the porch of the small house with the peeling railing finally repaired now, and said with more humility than Abby had ever heard from her, "I spent so many years afraid of watching you love someone," the loosely repaired now, and said with more humility, "the way I loved your father completely." without any safety net beneath it, that I nearly pushed you toward a man who would have hurt you in ways I never even let myself imagine. I'm sorry, Abby. I was wrong about so much. You were trying to protect me, Abby said, taking her mother's hand. I understand that now more than I did before. It doesn't make everything right, but I understand it. On a clear afternoon in early autumn in the small garden behind the restored clinic, Elias Thorne and Abigail Shaw were married in a ceremony that included perhaps 40 guests. Jerry standing as best man, his composure finally completely undone by the time the vows were spoken. Margaret seated in the front row, weeping openly and without shame. Diane and Kayla together in the second row, their relationship still healing but no longer estranged. Mrs. Whitfield from the diner, who had closed the shop for the afternoon rather than miss it. There were no chandeliers, no 500-guest ballroom, no crystal or excess of any kind. There was only a small brass plaque nearby bearing 2 men's names, and 2 families finally fully made whole. I would have married you with nothing, Abby told him quietly before the ceremony began. You know that. I know, Elias said. That's exactly why it had to be you. There is a particular kind of lesson that only reveals itself slowly, the way Elias Thorne's own sight had slowly narrowed, and then, through love and family, and hard-won truth, somehow widened again into something clearer than it had ever been before. It is the lesson his father tried to teach him a lifetime ago in a small free clinic on the edge of poverty, that compassion given without expectation of return is never wasted, even when it takes 15 years or 3 careful weeks in a ragged coat to find its way back to the person who needs it most. It is the lesson Walter Shaw lived out every single day of his career, treating patients who could never repay him, never once regretting the cost. It is the lesson Abby carried forward, without even realizing she was carrying. Transaction, transaction, transaction. And the truest measure of a person's character is how they treat someone who has absolutely nothing left to offer. Them. It is also perhaps the harder lesson, the one buried inside Margaret Doyle's 15 years of silence, and inside Diane Shaw's fear-driven attempts to control her daughter's future. Love, real love, sometimes makes people do things that look from the outside like abandonment or control, when underneath it is only fear wearing the mask of protection. Forgiveness in this story was never about excusing what was done. It was about understanding it fully enough to finally set it down, and choose instead to build something new. And perhaps the final lesson is the simplest one of all, that wounds carried in silence only grow heavier with time, while wounds spoken honestly to a friend who has earned the right to hear them, to a mother finally found again, to a partner willing to hold your hand through the hardest truths of your life, become slowly survivable. Elias Thorne did not heal because his sight returned, or because justice was finally served, or even because his mother came home. He healed because, for the first time in 15 years, he let someone else help him carry what he had been carrying alone. What lesson did this story leave with you? Was it the reminder that kindness given freely always finds its way back, even after 15 long years? Was it the understanding that fear, however well-intentioned, can push the people we love toward exactly the harm we meant to protect them from? Or was it something more personal? A memory of your own father, your own mother, your own quiet act of decency toward a stranger who needed it more than you ever knew? We would love to hear which part of this story stayed with you the longest. Take a moment and share in the comments right below this video the lesson that touched you most deeply, or the moment in Elias and Abby's story that reminded you of someone in your own life. Your stories, your reflections mean more to this community than you might realize, and reading them is one of the greatest joys of sharing these stories with you. If tonight's story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Every like, every share, every comment helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for letting Elias, Abby, Margaret, and Diane's story become, if only for a little while, a part of your own evening. Take care of yourselves, be gentle with the people around you, and remember that kindness, however small it may seem in the moment, is never wasted. See you again in the next video.